Hello, BookTube. This is a book which I should have read years ago, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that I'm just now getting around to reading it, but here we are. This is Metamorphoses by Ovid. So I really should have read this a long time ago, especially since I actually started college as a classics major. Classics meaning the study of ancient Rome and Greece. I took Latin in high school, a couple semesters in college. I never got fluent in it, but I was interested in Latin literature, and the idea is that I would get around someday to reading the classics of ancient Rome. And Ovid is one of the big names for Latin literature. Yeah, I really should have read him 30 years ago, but I didn't, and eventually my interest moved on. I decided I was more interested in modern history than ancient history. I changed from classics to world history, and I left behind the world of Latin literature, and I just never came back to it. So this is long overdue, but I've come back to it at last. It's been on my list of books to read for the past couple years, influenced in no small part by Steve Donahue, who talks often on his channel about his love of Ovid. Made me curious to want to go back and read this classic. Also, a couple years ago, I reviewed on this channel Bulfinch's mythology, and in the course of researching Bulfinch's mythology, I became aware that it was heavily based on Ovid. I'll come back to that in a bit. It turns out it's very heavily based on Ovid, but anyways, come back to that. But when I was reading Bulfinch's mythology and researching it, I again was reminded that I really should come back and read Metamorphoses by Ovid. I was living in Vietnam for the past several years when it was a little bit difficult to get a hold of particular books. I did actually at one point take the trouble of looking up Metamorphoses on Project Gutenberg, because, it's 2,000 years old, so it's in the public domain. But the more modern English translations are not in the public domain because the individual translations are often copyrighted. The last time I looked, the translation on Project Gutenberg was a bit of an archaic translation, and it didn't seem to really flow. And I thought about reading it off Project Gutenberg and downloading it on my Kindle, but just never got around to it. But now I'm back in the United States, and a couple weeks ago I was browsing through a used bookstore, and they had a copy of this for only $6. It was a used book. So I thought, yeah, this is going to be the time I finally pick up and read Metamorphoses, the famous book by Ovid. And I did. And, as often happens in these cases, I suspect most of you out there on BookTube can identify with this. There's a book that you've been meaning to read for years. You know you should read it, but it's a little bit intimidating, and you put it off. And then one day you finally say, okay, I'm just going to do it. And then you pick up and read that book, and you're like, this is really good. This is incredibly readable. I don't know why I didn't read this years ago. I have been denying myself this pleasure all of these years. And yes, that is my experience here with Metamorphoses. Now, granted, I'm sure that this all depends on which translation you get. This was originally written in poetic style in Latin. My Latin never got to the point where I could read this even when I was studying it 30 years ago. I've forgotten most of the Latin that I ever learned. So I read this in English translation. This is the Penguin Classics, although I think Penguin Classics has a few different editions here. This one is Mary Innes, and it's a very readable prose translation. incredibly readable. Reads very smooth. It's just like reading a novel, essentially. Arguably, I am cheating by reading a prose translation, since this was originally a work meant to be read in verse. But I figure, well, as long as I'm getting the content, the story, it doesn't matter. Maybe someday I'll go back and try a verse translation. But yeah, for now I'm happy with this. And yeah, because this is written in prose, it's just really simple and smooth to read, and was not difficult at all. Yeah, a couple things made me to... Well, actually, sorry. I should lay the groundwork on this, shouldn't I? So, if you don't know, Ovid was a Roman poet who lived in the around the early 1st century AD, during the time of Augustus Caesar. Metamorphoses is his epic poem. According to Wikipedia, there's some definition about whether or not this fits the definition of an epic, but certainly long enough to be an epic. 15 books, 358 pages in this English translation, and full pages. So takes a bit to sit down and read it. I mention this whenever I review some sort of ancient classic, and I realize this is a very pedestrian point to make, but I'm always amazed when I read a big classic from the ancient world. Wow, they wrote all this without any typewriters, without any printing presses. It all had to be written out by hand. I mean, think how many paper scrolls this must have filled up to get all this out in handwriting. And then, for this to be preserved over the centuries means scribes had to copy the whole thing out by hand. I don't know how many times it must have been copied to get down to us, because the original scrolls that it was written on would have decayed over the years, so we are reliant on scribes copying the whole thing out to get down to us. And it's a massive work. It's really impressive that all of this copying for all these centuries with this huge poem went on longhand. But there you go. People have taken the trouble to copy it out over the centuries, and it has now come down to us, this very long poem. So it's a very long poem, and the theme of it is all the transformations in Greek mythology. Hence the name Metamorphoses. Many different transformations. So Ovid has gone through the Greek and Roman mythology and picked out, I think, all or close to all the myths in which something changes into something else. Usually it's a human being being changed into a plant or an animal by some will of the god. And he's taken all of these stories and he's put them together and woven them together into one book. Now, my understanding, and I'm not an expert by any means, but my understanding is that whenever you're reading a work of ancient mythology, something that was written during the Greek or the Roman times, they weren't writing these stories just to tell these stories, because they already knew these stories. The Greeks and the Romans already knew these stories backwards and forwards. They were just part of their culture. So whenever you read an ancient Greek work or an ancient Roman work that's dealing with mythology, they're retelling these stories with some sort of purpose in mind. Either there's a new twist that they're putting on the story, or there's a theme that they want to emphasize, or maybe they just want to tell it in a particularly artistic way to show off their artistic talent. But the actual story itself isn't so much the point as what they're doing with it in the retelling, is my understanding of this. And a corollary of this is that as a modern, you wouldn't want to read one of these ancient works as your introduction to Greek or Roman mythology. right? You'd want to read like a couple basic introduction to Greek mythology books first before jumping into Ovid. But you wouldn't need too much background with this book. If you read a couple basic introductions to Greek mythology, I think you should be ready for this. But do read a couple introductions to mythology first. Right. So what Ovid is doing in this, first of all, he's compiling all the transformation myths into one place. But then he has this interesting technique where it's all written as one continuous story, even though it's many different stories. So there's a single narrative thread which just starts at the beginning, and it's more or less chronological. So it starts off at the beginning of creation, and it goes all the way down to Augustus Caesar, who was, present day in Ovid's time. But one story will just lead into another, so that the line of connectivity is never broken. But then within that structure of one story leading to another, he embeds stories. So he'll be in the middle of one transformation story when the characters will stop to tell another story. So now we're inside the story within a story. And then he'll embed another story within that one sometimes. So we've got a story within a story within a story. And then as these concentric story circles go, perhaps you're familiar with this technique, one story will resolve itself, and then we'll zoom out again into the frame story for that story, and then that story will resolve itself, and we'll zoom back out again into the original story which had framed these other two stories. And so you've got layers of narrative and layers of storytelling all woven in together. And it's well done. It never gets too confusing. It gets a little bit, sometimes you have to stop and go back and say, okay, wait, where are we in the story here again? But it's in a fun way. It never gets to the point where you can't sort it out. And just seeing how everything gets layered up upon each other, or how these other stories are connected with each other, is fun. It's well done. It's fun to see this narrative go all over the place. About half a year ago, I reviewed an introduction to Greek mythology, or a handbook to Greek mythology, on this channel by, what was the name of the author? Robin Hard, was it? I'll look it up after I finish this video. But in my review of that book, it was a book that tried to sort out the chronology of Greek mythology and also the genealogy of Greek mythology. Because the ancients had this incredibly complex chronology and genealogies worked out for Greek mythology. It wasn't just a bunch of stories. It was stories that had a sequence, had a chronology, had different people descended from different people, but it was also an incredibly complex web with all these genealogies intersecting. But the ancients themselves spent a fair amount of brain power trying to work out exactly what the genealogies were and how everyone was related to everyone else. And, it reminds me of kind of nerd culture today, how invested people get today in fictional worlds and working out the continuity of different fandoms, be it Star Trek or comic books or something like that. That seemed to have existed in the ancient world with mythologies. I mention that because Ovid is making frequent use of this. He is kind of going through in roughly chronological order, the way these myths are arranged. He's jumping around a little bit in time as he's going back. Different characters are recalling stories from earlier time periods. And he's also frequently referencing these genealogies that go back and all intersect. Unfortunately, that handbook of Greek mythology that I reviewed half a year ago on this channel, I don't have it. It was a library book I got out of the university I was working with at Vietnam, so I'm back in America now. That book is half a world away, or that particular copy at least. But I was thinking, I did wish I had that in hand sometimes, so I could go back and check some of these genealogies. But you don't need it to follow the story. There are all sorts of references to so-and-so, descendant of so-and-so. And it occurred to me it would be interesting to keep track of all the genealogies if I still have that handbook with me. But you don't need it. You can still enjoy the story as a story. So yeah, it's a fun book like that. It's a little bit unclear what exactly the message of the book is. Maybe the message is just having fun with all these different stories that involve something changing into something else. But then there is a final book, Book 15, in which actually maybe something like a message does tend to appear. And according to Wikipedia, this is, I forget, the only book in the ancient world, or one of maybe a limited number of books in the ancient world, that actually has an epilogue expanding on the theme. Because one of the Roman kings, King Numa, goes and learns the teaching of Pythagoras. Now, I don't know a lot about Pythagoras. I don't know a lot about Pythagoras. One of these days I'm going to have to learn more about Pythagoras. But in this book, Pythagoras talks at the end about how everything is constantly in a state of change. And he goes through, the rivers, the oceans, the seasons, humans as they go from young to old. And it's a really interesting way to kind of tie this all together and make a point at the end of it. Because you've been reading all these you've been reading all these myths about everything changing into different things. You know, a human transformed into a tree, or a human transformed into a bird. But then you get to the end and it's like Ovid saying to you, through the voice of Pythagoras, look, we've been talking about all these fantastical stories about things changing in mythology, but it's actually changes the most common thing in the universe. Everything is constantly in a state of change. And he talks about cities which have changed over time, rivers which have changed over the time, altered their courses, land formations which have changed over time. He talks about time as being a series of waves that are just constantly coming at you and changing everything in their wake. And it's something which resonated with me. I've just come back to my hometown after many years living away from it and noticing how much has changed since I left. I'm in my middle age now, which is a period in which the body is beginning to change, and you're in a transition where you're losing your youthful vitality and getting into all the aches and pains of middle age, etc. My parents are getting older. People I know around me are getting older. Everything's changing. And so, maybe because that was on my mind, the ending here, where Ovid, through his character Pythagoras, is making the point about the universe is just constant change. And that's just the way it is. And you're always being flung forward with that change. I thought that was an interesting epilogue to all these stories about change. Right. So I mentioned before that Bullfinch's mythology was heavily based on this book. This is my my history with Bulfinch's mythology, I talked about this in a previous video, but when I was in my 20s and living in Japan, I had an audiobook of Bulfinch's mythology, which was one of the few audiobooks I had. This was back in the days before you could just listen to everything on the internet. And I used to listen to that over and over and over again when I was driving around. And as a result, I've got a lot of Bulfinch's mythology just burned into my memory. And a couple years ago when I was rereading Bulfinch's mythology and researching it, I discovered that it was based on Ovid. And I thought to myself, that makes sense. Once that was brought to my attention, I thought, okay, I can see how this is sounding like it probably did come from an ancient source. It does sound like kind of an old epic story. Sorry, that's not what I wanted to say. It does sound like an old style. The speeches that the characters give kind of do sound like they're an older style. But now that I've read the original Ovid, yeah, the speeches and a large part of the narration in Bulfinch's mythology is just copied directly from Ovid. Now the wording is slightly different than this edition because it's a different translator. Bulfinch was a Latin teacher himself, or was he a teacher or was he a hobbyist? He was a Latinist himself. So he obviously could read Ovid in the original Latin and must have done his own translations. This translation here is slightly different in the word choice, but aside from the words being a little bit different, you can just see exactly where Bulfinch has been copying from Ovid. So after having read this book, strikes me that Bulfinch gets too much credit for having his own mythology. Like we shouldn't call it Bulfinch's mythology. We should call it Ovid translated by Bulfinch, and not give Bulfinch the credit for all these stories which he is just translating from Ovid. Because I had so much of Bulfinch's mythology burned into my brain from the days when I used to listen to it as an audiobook, a lot of this was just repeating the same stories and the same speeches I had already learned from Bulfinch's mythology. And I guess it has good and bad points. On the positive side, makes me feel a little bit less guilty about waiting so long to read Metamorphoses. Because in a way, I actually did read a lot of this book before. I just got it through Bulfinch's translation. On the negative side, it did mean that maybe these speeches or these stories were not as amazing to me as they would have been if I had been discovering them for the first time. Because there is a lot of skill in the retelling here. The characters go into long speeches, and I know that sounds bad. I know you're thinking, great, I've got to listen to all these long, boring speeches. But the speeches are actually quite well done. And according to the translator's introduction here, I guess Ovid was using the best rhetorical styles in the Middle East. Sorry, not in the Middle East, in the ancient world. He was using the best rhetorical styles in the ancient world when he created these speeches for his characters. The way they sum up points, the way they anticipate the points on the other side and then rebut them, and just this whole elegant style of speeches, which his characters do quite well. In addition to the various world building that goes on. So again, I mentioned before that the ancient writers were not telling the stories just to retell the stories. Everybody already knew the stories, but they were trying to do it with a bit of art. And I don't know exactly what the state of the original stories would have been before Ovid got his hands on a lot of these. But when he retells them, he's definitely creating a scene. He's giving character motivations. He's talking when characters go into like the halls of the gods, he's talking about what tapestries the gods have up. And there's I guess you might call it world building here, where he's immersing you into these stories. He's not just giving you the bare bones, he's doing everything to draw you into these stories as much as possible. So that I think I imagine I would have appreciated it even more if I hadn't already had this previous exposure from Bullfinch, but it's quite well done. Now, not all of these stories were in Bullfinch, for various reasons. One reason, Bullfinch in his introduction to Bullfinch's mythology makes clear that he's going to skip over any stories that have embarrassing morals, because he doesn't think those are suitable for the modern reader. It was the 19th century, I guess that's what they were at. So as you're reading this one, there's a fair amount of stories in here that aren't in Bullfinch. And with many of these stories you can say, okay, I know why Bullfinch left that out. Basically anything with a sexual theme, Bullfinch left it out. So there are, there are a lot of rapes in here. I mean, sorry, but there are. In my review of the Handbook of Greek Mythology, which I did half a year ago, I mentioned that as well. That when you get into classical mythology, it's just really surprising just how many rapes there are. But not only rapes, there are stories of incest in here. There are stories of homosexuality. There are stories of, there's a character in here called Hermaphroditus, who I guess is where we get the word hermaphrodite from. So you get Hermaphroditus' story. So yeah, it's more interesting than Bullfinch. Skip Bullfinch. Go directly to Ovid. You're getting your money's worth in terms of interesting stories. There's also, for example, there's a story in here which is not in Bullfinch's mythology, and I don't believe, about the war between the Lapis and the Centaur. So the fight that breaks out at a marriage when the Centaurs have too much wine. If you're vaguely familiar with Greek mythology, you probably vaguely recognize this story, which is incredibly well told here. Sorry, I thought I heard something buzzing. Goes on for several pages. We're talking about all the different characters that are fighting each other. Sometimes I lost track a little bit of who was who. And again, this might be where it would be useful to have a Handbook of Greek Mythology handy next to you. But yeah, that story about the big centaur fight was one of the many stories in here that was quite well told. There are a lot of stories in here that are very well told. I don't have time to talk about all of them. In fact, I'm almost out of time right now. The camera I'm using has a 30-minute time limit, so I'm going to have to wrap this up really quickly. What else is there to say about this? There's just a lot of really interesting stories in here, and they are well told. So, if you, like me, have thought to yourself that you should read this book someday, but you haven't got around to it yet, just go ahead and read it. Find yourself a modern translation. It's a very painless read. You should have a little bit of familiarity with Greek mythology before you attempt this, but you don't need a lot. A vague familiarity, I think, will do. You might not catch every reference if you don't have your Handbook of Greek Mythology next to you, but you don't need to catch every reference. You can still enjoy the stories as stories. So, it's a definite recommend, and I'm glad I finally got around to reading it.